What is up, my people? My name's Anton and welcome back to September. Today, I'm walking you through one of the most straightforward ways that you can create a shrink wrap result just like this in either Octane or Redshift. So the reason that I say either Octane or Redshift on this one is because we're going to be employing a few of the ideas from the last video. So I'm going to kind of run through the methods a little quicker than I normally would. But we're going to be importing the rocks from Megascans, sourcing them from there. And then, of course, the shrink wrap actual cloth material itself, which is going to be a glass. So you can use whatever render engine of choice on this one. I say that because I feel like I might have alienated a bit of my audience since I started uploading Octane tutorials and now moving to Redshift. But in reality, all I really want to do is kind of cover all bases. So as I start to learn more about Redshift myself, I kind of want to make sure that we're bringing everyone together a little more. But yeah, it's a really cool result. It looks sick. A few people have done this before, but I figured I'd just sort of simplify it down in case people struggle to get a grasp of it and just cover a few basic concepts. So without any further ado, let's head straight into C4D. So we're inside C4D here. And for anyone who's wondering, I'm now running on Cinema 4D 2023, which is the same version which has the Pyro update. I feel like a lot of you guys who are using maybe R26 most likely have the Maxon app license, so it's pretty easy for you to update anyway. If not, I highly recommend it. They've got super cheap student license going if you're a student. Well worth it because you get all the free updates, and it works super well with Redshift. Just seems to be a little smoother, especially a lot of the simulation mechanics. So if you're not working on that, I'd highly recommend it. So I've got a file saved here with what my actual selections were for the rocks, but if I just simplify this file real quick, we can see that all we're really working with are these 4 rocks here. So this is just a case of importing from Megascans like normal. Just make sure your render engine is set here to Redshift before you export, and we'll be working with these for today's tutorial. Something I definitely realized while I was working on this was the difference between Megascans assets in Octane and Redshift. I don't know why, but definitely in Octane when I used to work, when I used to import assets, I used to have to mess with nodes and all sorts of stuff like displacement, making sure color spaces were activated to really get the look that you almost see in the preview on Bridge. But in Redshift, it was way easier to just import. You get your Redshift object tags chucked in there already, and the textures just looks amazing. They look great straight off the bat. So if you're wanting to really level up your Megascans assets, or you're working a lot with nature or rocks or concept renders like me, I'd recommend that too. But for now, these are the 4 rocks that we're going to be using. There was a reason I sort of wanted them a little more varied. I could have just taken one and then randomized it, but I wanted to level it up a little more, and I thought it looked better if I varied it. So we've got 4 rocks here that we're going to be working with. And the actual scene setup is going to be pretty simple here. So like I said, we're working with a few of the same concepts from the last video. So if you're new to forces, or you're new to simulating rigid bodies in general, and cloth for that matter, take a look at my last video. I sort of run over a little bit more, sort of like sketching out ideas and stuff. But all the geometry here was obviously pre-made. So we just take a look at our lines, or maybe if we go to hidden lines so we can actually see, this is all topologized for us, pretty decent. It's just sort of high poly where it needs to be, and generally this works pretty well. We're working with rigid bodies, so that already tends to be one of the lighter sort of simulations that you can run. But the general idea is we're going to be chucking these into a fracture just here, which allows us to then apply effectors to this. So we can tomograph now and then get ourselves a random, for example, and then space these out a little more. So let's go to something like maybe 500. You've got a useful strength effector here, so it doesn't matter if you go a little overboard. We can just make sure our values are pretty high, so we're getting enough rotation. And what we're really looking for is just a seed which sort of scatters them evenly around this midpoint here. So these are seemingly all right, but they seem a little one-sided. So if we just flip through here, we can just find something that works. And honestly, that does a pretty good job. So let's set it, I usually set it to like 50 or 60%. Maybe let's go for like 60. And what we're gonna be doing is grabbing a attractor force to literally dump in the middle here, get them moving in, and then find a simulation there that we like. So I'm gonna save this up real quick. And we can get going. So if I head to draw shading real quick, what we want to do is head to our fracture here. Let's right click and go simulate, rather bullet tags, and then rigid body. Let's make sure we're in our mode project, and under the bullet tab, just make sure our gravity is set to 0. Simulations are still split in Cinema 4D between this actual simulation tab here and the older sort of like bullet simulation. So these two are both relevant. And what's unique about this is that we'll be using the rigid body simulations from this tag in bullet, like it's always been. So that's where these parameters are sort of going to affect that tag, but we're going to also be using the cloth tag later on to sort of create a shrink wrap effect, and everything related to that is going to be under this simulation tab. So make sure you're bearing that in mind. But for now, what we should now be able to do is if we just increase this and play, it will register them, but there's nothing actually affecting them yet. So we head up to simulate forces attractor. Let's whack the strength right up to something like 5,000, create ourselves a spherical field, which is basically going to pick out the area where this is going to be affected by. Let's take a look at what happens with this. Obviously it's not going to be the right effect, but let's just make sure that we're working. Make sure you're saying it's include here. Save up always before you're about to simulate. And those rocks are going to get blasted to another dimension. So we need to make sure we're heading into our spherical field here under remapping, tick invert. And what we kind of want to do is really shrink this down. If you have this all the way to the middle, what's going to happen is that's going to be like a real hot point. As soon as the rocks reach that, they're kind of just going to glitch out or jitter or get thrown into the fourth dimension. So what you kind of want is for them to be fairly small, enough that the rock can sort of like sit there, if that makes sense. You'll see what I mean any second. Because what will happen now is they'll sort of just bustle about here. And this is where obviously you kind of want to gauge how much movement you want. This is going to be the center of your piece. So, you know, it tends to look pretty good at the beginning as they rotate over each other. But about halfway through the timeline, what tends to happen is they kind of find a safe position and sit. So a few things you can do at this point is sort of heading into your not collision tag, your rigid body, and for example, messing with the friction a little bit. So if we turn that down, they'll start to bustle a little more. We can obviously have the bounce all the way up, but rocks don't really bounce, right? So maybe we can keep that a little lower. And you obviously don't want them bouncing too far out. That would be a bit crazy with the shrink wrap. That is asking for trouble. So if we turn the friction down to maybe, you're going to need to heighten the friction. So let's move it up to 50. I'm pretty sure it was at that before. But you want enough that it still looks dynamic. This looks a little weird. That's not what you want. So let's find the sweet spot. Let's maybe 40. It's that one flying bit at the start, which I'm... And now what you can do is, if you still want more movement and you kind of want to, I want to dislodge them at the end here. The start looks great. But what we can do is grab a turbulence field. So let's go up here and just get ourselves turbulence. And then make sure that under rigid bodies and force, we're dropping that in. What you kind of want here is you want to bear in mind the size. So I was in here and I believe the settings I used last time was a scale a little smaller than I normally use, maybe something like 50% and a strength of, let's just say 50 for now. The higher your scale is here, it's basically going to move the rocks around almost as a group. So what you saw there where they were kind of sitting on each other and jittering, the higher your scale is, it will move that all about. If we do this, you'll see it's creating a pretty strong effect, but it's this that we want to kind of work on. So let's even turn the scale down a little bit. And you'll see that ideally it's going to create turbulence fields that you can't actually see, but do affect these rocks. And now we're getting that sort of rotation that we had in the example, sorry. So you can sort of work with this. Now you can sort of gauge what you're working with. But again, they sort of settle and start to look a little weird. So maybe let's create 75. You can also play with the frequency a little bit. If you really want to dislodge them, then it's almost like your best bet is to turn the scale down as far as you can and then up the strength. You actually have some pretty cool looks there. Again, this is a good example of another scene where you can sort of pick out your actual like timeline length. This is something I realized recently that for some reason I completely overlooked. I just thought if I've got a 10-second timeline, 300 frames, I'm going to use all of it. And you really don't need to. If you have parts where it like considerably looks better, so a lot of the randomization here looks far better, then don't feel like you need to use the whole bit. Like these first 200 frames look way better than if you were just to start this sort of jumbling at the end, you know what I mean? So, I mean, unless you've got a strict need for, 10 seconds of frames, you can always do something creative in post. It's worth bearing in mind. So one last thing I'm going to do here is these are flying out a little much at the top. So I'm going to up the attractor just a little more. and hope that it may actually need to increase the, it's getting quite a lot of craziness there. Let's head to our collision. Let's increase the friction one more time. We may need to move that down or something. Let's take a look. So we definitely want to keep this to, keep it to acceleration. We're getting flying about a little bit there. So let's, these are looking cool, but still a little much. I think bounce needs to be set to 0% really. What's happening there is it's where the turbulence is too strong, so we really need to turn that down. Something a little more like this, although, again, let's take a look at 10. See, what's going to be a problem is we need to bear in mind that there's going to be a lot of, I don't know if there's a word for this sort of method, but almost like glitch aversion. You want to look at this, and this bit where the rock is jumping out, that is going to, unless you're very lucky with your cloth simulation, that will likely tear through your cloth later on when you create that shrink wrap, or you're going to have to up the collision passes to like 200 or something. I'm pretty sure that's what I did last time to sort of troubleshoot. But let's take a look at it. I'm going to increase this again to maybe 7,000. Grab our turbulence, turn this, I don't want to have it so high, but let's just take a look at what if we, that's far too high. Let's take a look here. Still getting a lot of flying about, but these bits here look all right. Let's see what happens if we up the attractor. So they sort of find their sweet spot a little bit, but what if we grab our spherical field and then increase this? That looks a bit better, I'd say. That creates some more diversion, so we can always do that. I'd say I'm pretty happy to work with this. These move a little bit from side to side, so let's tone down the turbulence a little bit. You know what? Let's not overcomplicate it. We can render this out now. So the good thing about this is that you can sort of work on your simulations one at a time. With this now, what we can do is literally cache it. So let's head here, go to cache and bake all. And now our workflow for this in general is, let's grab our forces here because they're going to be separate from the other ones. We can just toggle them invisible. What's great about this is what we're going to do now is this is rendered out, and we need to create a cloth object which is going to shrink and change this cached rigid body simulation here to a collider object. So the way we're going to go about doing that is, let's go to the start here where they're at the most expansive, because we need to have the sphere just a little higher than that, but that is where we're going to go and create our cloth. So if we go to sphere, make sure we're working in hidden line here. Let's scale this up to something like just a little wider than this. I find works best. Otherwise it's going to catch on the simulation at the start. That's great. So we can just head into our X-ray here, and that works well. We want to make sure we're going in here and setting the type to icosahedron. Seems to work better with cloth simulations in general. And up the segments to something that isn't too dense, but works well enough. Again, you kind of want your creases and stuff. That's what makes the cloth look good. So bear that in mind. But if we save up, we have the ability to keep this as a sphere without baking it. And we can right click on that, head to simulation, cloth. And we have already changed the gravity in here to 0, so we don't have to worry about that. And if we play, our sphere is going to be moving about now. Allow, I think it's got the forces already, right, so it's got the forces already affected, and we want them separate for this. So if we head into our cloth and just grab our attractor and turbulence and drop them in here to exclude, what we see is that cloth is just going to hover at the start, which is perfect. Now, the way we're going to create this shrink wrap effect is by utilizing this tab here. Now, the reason I said I'm working in 2023 was because I don't remember this tab being in R26. So if you are working in R26, either downgrade or version up, but this is what we're going to be using. The reason I think that's worth mentioning is because I couldn't actually find a workaround in the last version. There may well be, but I couldn't find it, and I remember Googling for a while, and this is what fixed it to me. But the target length is essentially what allows you to either grow or shrink that cloth. The bendiness and stretchiness has an effect to an extent, but this is what creates something exaggerated enough for it to actually look like a shrink wrap, right? So what's important to know about this as well is that you want to keyframe it. You don't want to just have it set at the start. Otherwise, what you'll end up with is something that looks like that. And I need to pause that simulation before it glitches out. But in terms of the settings, again, we don't need anything too crazy. We can right click on the fracture here and grab our collider object. So that's not something we have to worry about. And we can head here, and the bendiness we can have fairly low. Obviously you want it bendy, but it's the stretchiness that you really want. So we'll set that to 5. The bounciness we can have at 0. Bendiness, let's leave it at 2. Thickness we don't have to worry about. I'm just having a little gander here. I think we're all right. And the target length is what's important. So this is where you can sort of pick out your timeline, because what we're going to need to do with this is keyframe it at 100 at the start. And then let's take a look here so we can see what our rocks are doing. We want to about, I'd say here, maybe 30 frames. We want this to be much smaller. So let's head that to 50 and take a look what this looks like right now, because what should happen is we'll get the shrink and then the rocks will move around the side of it, but this is nowhere near small enough. So let's head back here, go to our last keyframe and maybe move this down to something like 20. Let's give that a shot. Trial and error again. What will happen is, and now you're getting it move, but we've had this rock tear out. So that's something to bear in mind. That happens. I think that happened with a pebble before. And this is almost one of the only issues with what we've got here. If there's too much velocity or it's sharp in a weird instance, you're going to get that. So let's take a look here. If we have a look in our side view, we can take a look at what's actually going on. It looks pretty sweet. Right, so let's see what happens if we, for example, up that ever so slightly. So we want our stretchiness to like 10. Bendiness, maybe let's keep that at 0. Maybe let's move this down to 10 and see what happens. What we have the ability to do is mess with our segments. So, okay, so the smaller it is, more likely those rocks are gonna cut out, it almost seems like. If we head here and move it to something like 40. Not really small enough. 30, I think it was a problem before, so let's take a look. You've got your stickiness values here as well. Seems to look a little weird. You've got friction. Let's have a little look here. I'd argue that you want this probably smaller, but we head this down to 25, maybe friction 10. Stickiness 5, bendiness 5. Let's see. All right, let's head to our mode here. Let's go to our simulation and up our collision passes to something like 50. Create our subsets up to 50, maybe 2. Let's see, it might slow down our simulation a little bit, but ideally, this is great. But we still got this rock here. What may be worth doing is moving where this is actually keyframed. So if we take this to something like, let's have a look. We've got a pretty cool shrink wrap here. And we have less velocity. This is what I meant about the velocity. You really want to be careful with your initial rigid body simulation, and maybe even go back and recache if you're having a problem whereby they're almost tearing out, because that velocity is not your friend when it comes to working with something like this. One thing I'd be inclined to do is turn this down a little bit. So let's maybe make this 10 just so it seems a little tighter, and hope that nothing happens. You'll see, even though we've got cloth tearing unticked here, we still get some issues. So bear that in mind. These seem to look all right. I'm dare to up the segments one more time so we get a little bit more detail on that cloth, and let's have a little look. at the kind of result we're getting. Better. It's morphing. We're not getting anything explode or take out. So that looks pretty cool at the minute. The good thing is if your simulation is responsive, you can kind of change how this looks like in here. Okay, so increase your bendiness. Your bendiness is important. Let's up that a bit. Bouncing probably isn't your best thing. Maybe your friction can go down. Let's have a look here. I like this bit. That's almost where I want them to shrink to. So let's start at 20. Move it down to this and have a look what happens. So we're getting a little bit of tearing, but it is handling it, which is cool. The more we can get away with this, almost like the better. So I'd almost argue they're working with something pretty decent here. And obviously as this flows through, we're going to get something which looks more and more consolidated. We're far from done with this cloth. What we need to do is, obviously, if we look at the topology right now, we're working with something which has detail, but nowhere near enough. So what we can do is drop it into a cloth surface in a sec, which is going to add some thickness, some subdivisions, and ultimately make that look a little better. But if we take a look, we can pause this, head to our cloth up here, go to cache, and let's cache the scene and see what we're working with. For now, it's going to let us play it back in real time, so we can actually make sure we're not messing anything up, and then we should be okay. As far as rendering is, again, we'll just, I believe we already have one in here, but it's just a case of a dome light, anything simple. We'll be rendering on a black background, and just making sure that our glass material works well. And then we can box it off into whatever resolution we want. Beauty. So let's have a look here. We'll be starting from about frame 45 in this instance, but it looks like we're getting some pretty nice stretching and general cloth performance here. So it's almost like we were lucky in this situation. What we're going to try now is let's grab ourselves a cloth surface to do what I did before. Drop the sphere inside the cloth surface. We can look at this in this so we can see exactly what's going on. What I also realized is that this is almost a pretty good, strangely, this is almost a good representation of taking a look at what happens with the actual rigid bodies colliding with the cloth. Especially when you're rendering, take note of where these intersections occur. It's almost weird, you have to like zoom out the more you zoom in, but they are there. And what will happen is, I noticed this was me being super nitpicky on the original render, but what you get are these sort of, what you get are these points where the rocks are right up against the cloth, and you can almost see that the shading isn't different, but it's where they're so pressed up. You can see it here, this sort of sectioning here. That's that intersection, and I think it might be really lightly intersecting with the cloth. And this is why you need to thicken it, basically, is what I'm saying. But at this point here, it's only for like a frame or so, but it's where the rocks are so pushed up against, and in Redshift, you have the reflection roughness turned down to like, I think I had it in 0.2 here. So what it means is that they're a little further away, you actually have some really light roughness on the surface. And when they're right up against it, obviously there's not too much because of the distance. But stuff like that, it's sort of worth looking at. But I think that's what you're seeing here. So if we go into our cloth surface now and then add the thickness to something like 2, you can see they go away. So if we turn this up, you can increase or decrease the subdivision sort of like as you want, if you want something which is more detailed, but I think this will almost work pretty well. Let's take a look here. You've got to bear in mind that your cloth surface isn't going to be running all the time. What will happen is, it will work and then stop. So you want to bear that in mind when you're pausing and actually creating preview renders, but just inspect at this point, make sure nothing weird's going on. Let's take a look at our camera setup. We've got one here and one here. So let's have a look at this one. Again, this is what I mean. It intersects and then it fixes. If you are in an extreme circumstance, you can always work that up. But take a look at your side view to see how thick you're actually working with. I think something like this works. This is also a good shot to sort of like look around and make sure everything's working as it is. if you're in a position where you want more subdivisions, you can try that. That will, of course, give yourself a little more stretching capabilities. But I'd argue, of course, that's going to sort of offset your simulation a little bit. What's great about this is because if you're using Megascans, your actual geometry, scale, and topology is going to basically be on the same plane as what I'm working with. But as I've sort of mentioned before, your geometry and general topology segments are the biggest players in simulating like this. So what we can do now is, let's say these are both cached. So if we head to the frame that we actually like, maybe something like 40, we've got quite a bit of velocity here, but what we should see is, like I said, ignore that because they will work fine. You'll see our rocks sort of rotate inside this shrink wrap, which looks pretty cool. Again, you don't have to use rocks, you can use whatever you want, but I thought this looks pretty cool. So let's start looking at rendering now. I'm going to run over this really quickly because I don't think it really needs too much discussion. I want to sort of navigate my tutorials unless they're specific to the render engine on something that all people can do. And I've got experience with both, so I figured I'd hover over it. But I've got my assets imported as Redshift right now. So I'm literally just going to drop in here real quick and so show you how simple the material creation process actually is for this. So what we have here is a dome light, which I don't think has any texture at all, or rather it does. It has a same texture as last time. It's just this HDRI Studio from Grayscale Gorilla. I'm pretty sure it's desaturated. So again, just a studio which looks like this. Really simple. I never really need to go that complex with my lighting if I'm creating concept renders in Redshift, which is great. What we're going to do is, again, untick the background, so we're creating something like before. If we toggle off the cloth, just double check, you can see our rocks already look pretty good. So this is what I meant about Megascans in Redshift. They, for some reason, look far more realistic and detailed. If you take a little closer look here, just detail and displacement in general looks sick on these, with not a lot of advanced lighting, which is really cool. So you can see our rocks, like sort of look development wasn't something that we really need to worry about. If we go back into our Redshift camera here, let's toggle this on, and we are quite literally heading up here to create a standard material. Again, if you're in Octane, you can just grab a specular material and drag it on at this point. And we're going to move this to our gloss surface under here. Let's go to our transmission tab. We're making a really easy glass material here, and setting our weight to 1. And we now have, any second, glass on our thing. So a few things here. Obviously, I've got the dome light set up quite high with an intensity of 5. So the reflection of this is going a little crazy. So we can turn our weight down to maybe something like 0.2, I think I had before. Like I mentioned, your roughness here is what sort of segments the segments. It's what creates the sort of like blurry effect somewhat between where the rocks are really close to the cloth and where they're a little further away. The reason I have the dome intensity set so high here is because it looks way better on the rocks at that intensity. So if I turn the weight down to 0 here, we've got a little bit of refraction, but we don't want that all the way down. We can set this to 0.05 maybe. And let's, for this, just turn our roughness down to 2. And that's going to really create our glassy, plasticky shrink wrap effect. So yeah, surprisingly, roughness actually does play a decent part here in look development. Something that I thought was worth doing as well was, I've mentioned this before, but if we're working with plastic, that's the kind of look that we're going for in this instance. We can just go plastic IOR, and that's going to give you the index of refraction for what plastic actually is. And we can see here it's 1.460. So you may as well just head up here and go 1.460. And now our reflection, if we just double check here, transmission, there's nothing here. Our reflection is now going to be according to actual plastic, which is always sick. So now we can always get a little crop sort of render view to see if you want a more specific area, sort of see what our plastic looks like. But you've generally created that basic plastic look. And as we roll through, we'll be able to look, develop, and sort of pick out parts that you like. And that is the basis for sort of creating that look. Again, if you're having trouble, 2 things to bear in mind are your collision passes your cloth thickness and the subdivisions in your sphere here. If you wanted to up those, you probably get a little more detail, but for the sake of safety in this tutorial, I don't want to spend 30 minutes troubleshooting, and you will create something which looks pretty sick like this. So give it your best shot. Something I will mention is, obviously, if you're rendering this, I'll quickly run over what my render settings typically are for something like this, specifically out of Redshift in this instance, but I'm rendering in, I think I have a setting here for mobile, so that's the TikTok or short resolution. And if we head into Redshift here, I've got my bucket quality set to medium, never really changed it from that. My progressive passes pretty much stay the same. But what's worth mentioning about this is, in this case, the motion blur won't work if you just tick it like this. You'll notice, because you need to tick this deformation blur. A lot of the movement in here is coming from simulations, right? So that's rigid body and cloth. And deformation, specifically with the cloth as well, is what actually applies to cloth movement and simulation in that regard. So unless you're actually keyframing, which in this case we're not, you need to make sure you're ticking that if you're not seeing motion blur. And you're free to, at this point, render it out. Another thing that I ran into while I was running this last one was I had my timeline trimmed from where I actually wanted it to start to the end here, and I just set my frame range here to all frames, and that created a glitch where the two caches weren't synced, if that makes sense. For some reason, my cloth would be in the shape that I wanted it to be, but the rocks would still be far out. And the way I fixed that was actually changing this here to 0 and then setting it manual here and then changing that to, whatever frame it was, 40 to 300. And then it would actually sync up and render out properly. So just thought that was worth mentioning. But in general, that's how you're creating a shrink wrap effect in Cinema 4D and Redshift. So we just let this render out at a cool frame here. What's great about this is the tighter you sort of have it as well, you'll get these points where the rocks really push to the edges of the cloth, and you can almost see the shapes, the geometry of the rocks through the cloth, which I thought was really sick. Again, a really nice job. This could almost use with a little bit less of the cloth surface, I think. So maybe something like 1, which looks cool, makes it look a lot thinner. But again, this is dependent on your case. If you're having a problem where you don't want it to intersect or too much, or it looks a bit off, you can fix that up there. But in general, this is what we're making, and we've got a lot of freedom in this material too. If you want to change your transmission, we can get ourselves some sort of like nice ambery gold sort of color, and that what you'll have is, well, that's far too much. But if we lighten this up a little bit, we can almost change the color here. So if we want this to be for some reason pink, you can add some really light touches to whatever color it is. You can add some ramps and stuff, and create some pretty sick looks. So without waffling anymore, I'll leave you with that. And if you make anything cool, let me know. So that is how you create shrink wrap in Cinema 4D 2023. As usual, if you have any questions or any problems, let me know below. I'll try my best to help you out. And I'll see you very soon in the next video. So thank you everybody for watching.